The scent of rain-soaked earth and wilting roses still clung to the air in the grand, silent chapel when the sound of her stilettos shattered the sacred quiet. They clicked against the marble floor with a chilling metronomic precision, each step an affront to the hymn that had just faded into the vaulted ceiling. She hadn't come to mourn my son, Julian. She had come to auction his ghost. At his funeral, before the flowers had even begun to weep, Isabel Croft, the woman who had evaporated from his life 15 years ago, strode in and laid claim to the $24 million he left behind, as if it were a coat she had forgotten in his closet. My chest constricted, a band of ice tightening around my ribs. The whispers that rippled through the pews were sharper than the cold November wind outside. I stood frozen, caught between the crushing weight of grief and a white-hot fury, realizing this final betrayal was not just against me, but a desecration of my son's memory. What was about to unfold would tear the mask from every face in that room, leaving no shadow in which to hide. Isabel stopped just short of the altar, a vision in a ruthlessly tailored black dress that seemed to absorb the candlelight. A smirk, faint but unmistakable, played on her lips as her eyes scanned the stunned mourners. Then she spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying with a theatrical clarity she must have rehearsed for days. I am here to claim what is mine. The $24 million estate my husband, Julian Vance, left behind. As his lawful wife, I have every legal right to it. The air was stolen from the room. A woman in the front row gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. Men in dark suits turned to each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and outrage. But I didn't look at them. I didn't even look at her. My gaze remained fixed on the polished mahogany casket. Julian's name, carved into a simple brass plate, gleamed softly. He hadn't been gone 10 minutes, and she was already here, her claws reaching for the life he had so painstakingly rebuilt without her. It wasn't sadness that struck me in that moment. It was a searing heat that climbed from my stomach into my throat, a quiet, dense rage that settled behind my ribs like a block of granite. I pressed my palm flat against the wool of my dress, commanding the tremor in my hand to cease. My late husband always said I had the patience of a mountain. That day, I would be a fortress. Beside Isabel, a young, nervous lawyer fumbled with a sheaf of papers in a garish blue folder. His voice trembled as he began to cite statutes on marital status and survivors' rights, referencing a clause in a policy he clearly hadn't read with sufficient care. He was a pawn, too green to realize she had signed away every conceivable right in their divorce settlement over a decade ago. To my left, Clara Monroe, my lawyer, and the only other soul in this chapel who knew what was coming, gave me the faintest of nods. Her hand was already resting on the clasp of her briefcase. "Not yet," her eyes said. "Let her finish digging." The whispers had now grown into a low, anxious hum. Isabel's entrance had done more than shatter the silence. It had shattered the fragile illusion of peace. Mourners shifted in their seats, some staring at the floor, others staring at me, their eyes filled with a morbid pity, waiting for me to collapse. But I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, I turned to face her. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, met mine with the cold confidence of a predator who believes its prey is already cornered. She lifted her chin, a gesture of undisguised pride. Perhaps she expected tears, pleading, a messy, undignified scene right there in front of God and everyone. I gave her nothing. My stillness seemed to unnerve her more than any outburst could have. Her voice grew louder, a shade more brittle. "I am not here to create conflict. I am here to collect what is legally mine." Finally, I spoke. My own voice was calm, measured, and colder than the Seattle rain lashing against the stained glass windows. "You are not his wife. Not anymore." For a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Her lawyer whispered something urgent, shuffling papers, but the damage was done. I saw it on her face. She had gambled on my grief, counting on me being too shattered to think, too broken to fight back. She thought this sacred space was her stage. She was wrong. Clara moved forward, silent as a shadow, and handed the officiating pastor a sealed document, the divorce decree, stamped, notarized, and finalized over 14 years ago. The clause waiving all future claims to assets, current or forthcoming, was highlighted. I didn't need to say another word. The truth was there in black and white, and the profound hush that fell over the room was more damning than any shout could ever be. Isabel stood rigid, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes darted around the chapel, searching for an ally, a friendly face, a single person to speak up for her. No one did. The mourners who had pitied me moments before now looked at her with a new, colder understanding. I stood there, not triumphant, not smug, just steady. For 15 years, I had been the one by his side. She had left him with a mountain of medical debt from an accident and a shattered heart. I was there for every grueling chemotherapy session, every surgery, every panicked late-night call when the pain outran the medication. She had vanished, a ghost in his history, until the news of his success made it worth her while to resurrect herself. When I finally turned to leave the chapel, I didn't look back. With Clara beside me, I walked toward the heavy oak doors, my steps slow and even. I heard someone whisper my name with sympathy. Another muttered, "Justice." But I didn't need their sympathy, and I wasn't seeking justice. Not yet. This wasn't the end. This was the opening salvo in a war I never wanted, but was now determined to win. What was coming next would make this funeral look like a polite prelude. We didn't leave the chapel in silence. Behind us, the murmurs swelled into conversations, chairs creaked, and Isabel's voice, now sharp with a tremor of fury, followed us out into the wind. Outside, the funeral director, his face pale and flustered, rushed to apologize for the disruption. "Don't worry," I told him, my voice flat. "Death doesn't always come with dignity." In the car, Clara drove while I stared out at the gray, weeping sky of downtown Seattle. My hands were folded in my lap, my breathing slow and controlled. There's a difference between calm and controlled. And it took exactly 11 minutes to reach the offices of Monroe Associates. The conference room was waiting. Clara locked the door behind us and placed 2 documents on the polished table. The first was Julian's updated last will and testament, dated 9 months before he died. I had been there, holding his thin but steady hand as he signed it. Every asset, the money, the company stock, the property overlooking Puget Sound, the insurance payout, even the intellectual property rights to the revolutionary app he'd designed in his final months, was left to me. There was no mention of Isabel Croft. Not a single word. The second document was the divorce settlement, with its ironclad waiver. Clara had a certified copy, complete with the county filing record. No loopholes, no ambiguity. "Isabel has no legal ground," Clara said, her voice measured. "But she's audacious. She will escalate this." I nodded, my jaw clenched, not in fear, but in focus. For years I had mourned the son I was losing. Now, I would defend the man he was. I would not allow a woman who had been absent for 15 years to turn the final chapter of his life into a sordid legal circus. Clara handed me the estate inventory. As I scanned the list, my eyes caught on the final item. A private video letter, recorded by Julian and stored digitally under attorney-client protection. I hadn't known. Clara tapped the folder. "It's time." We drove to the courthouse, not for a hearing, but for a meeting Clara had arranged with a probate judge regarding emergency procedures. Given the size of the estate and the obvious hostility, the judge agreed to an early review. Within an hour, a temporary protection order was issued over the entire estate, and Isabel's claims were flagged as invalid upon filing. Back on the courthouse steps, Isabel's lawyer called Clara's phone. She answered on speaker Yesai. His voice cracked as he requested a meeting to discuss a joint resolution. Clara's reply was glacial. All communication would be in writing, and Mrs. Croft's abhorrent behavior at a religious service would be noted in every formal response. I remained silent. The time for silent endurance was over. That evening, alone in the quiet of my house, I opened the file containing Julian's video letter. He was sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, the city lights twinkling behind him. His voice was calm, clear. He spoke of the foundation he wanted me to build, the community scholarships, the memorial garden he envisioned. He spoke about me, about the strength I had shown, the strength he hoped I would keep. Then, near the end, his eyes found the camera, and it felt as if he were speaking directly to me across time and space. If she comes back, Mom, I need you to stand your ground, not just for me, for yourself. She walked away from me when I had nothing. But you never did. You deserve everything. I chose you. I played that part again, the words settling on my chest like a firm, gentle hand. There would be time for tears later. Right now, I had work to do. I opened my desk drawer and wrote down 3 names. 3 people who had stood by Julian when Isabel was a distant, bitter memory. One had access to his complete medical and financial records from the time of their split. Another had archived his company's development contracts. The third had personal emails that told a story of abandonment and resilience that no lawyer could spin. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting the truth. It had begun at a funeral, but by morning, this would become something else entirely. By the next morning, word of the confrontation in the chapel had spread like wildfire. My phone rang before sunrise, old neighbors, distant cousins, all calling to ask if I was holding up. But beneath the feigned concern, I could hear a morbid curiosity, a hint of doubt. I didn't return their calls. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, watching the dawn break over the yard where Julian had once played. Around 10, Isabel made her move. She posted a cropped, vintage photo of Julian online, one she had no right to possess. The caption was a masterpiece of manipulative grief. Heartbroken to say goodbye to the love of my life, may justice be served. The comments flooded in from strangers who saw only a grieving widow. Words like brave, tragic, and fight for what's yours filled the screen. That was when the battle shifted from the courtroom to the court of public opinion. I had the documents, but she had the narrative. I texted Clara. Her reply was immediate. Already monitoring. We respond, we don't react. At noon, I met Clara in a private room at an old library downtown. The walls were thick, soundproof. She laid out a 3-part plan. First, solidify our legal standing, already in motion. Second, consolidate our evidence. Julian's CFO, Anika Sharma, had emails. Leo, his old business partner, had notarized records. Marcus, the ICU nurse from his final week, had a written statement detailing the visits Isabel never made. The third part was Clara's masterstroke, not a press release, but a public event, a dedication for the launch of the Julian Vance Memorial Foundation. The best defense, Clara argued, isn't a courtroom. It's a crowd. We set the date for 3 days later at City Hall. The mayor, who had supported Julian's initial plans for the foundation, had already confirmed his attendance. That evening, Annika met me at Julian's old tech office. The space was dark and silent, but his presence lingered. On the whiteboard, half-erased notes on app functionality were still visible in his familiar script. Anika pressed a flash drive into my palm. On it were the last 2 months of Julian's private emails. 3 were flagged, 1 to Clara, 1 to Anika, and 1 to me. Saved as a draft, never sent. Mom, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if she shows up, I know it'll be hard. But I need you to remember you are the only one who stayed. You were there when I was more tubes than skin. You never once left the room. So don't let her rewrite what you and I both lived. I chose you, not her, never her. Any lingering doubt I had vanished. The pain and fury of the week coalesced into a single point of cold, clear resolve. She wanted to weaponize public opinion. I would arm them with the truth. 3 days after the funeral, I walked into City Hall through a back entrance. The auditorium was already filling up, local press, tech investors, community leaders. The event was billed as a dedication, the public launch of the Holbrook Memorial Foundation, but everyone knew it was a battlefield. At 10:05 a.m., Clara stepped to the podium. "Good morning," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "We are here to honor the vision of a man who left behind a plan for impact. What you will see today is not about loss. It is about intention, about clarity, about truth." The lights dimmed. A video appeared on the screen, dated 5 weeks before Julian's death. He sat in his chair, tired, but focused. "If you are watching this," his steady voice filled the silent room, "then I wanted to explain in my own words why I made the choices I did. I didn't want confusion. I wanted the truth to speak for itself." He spoke of his illness, his hopes for the foundation, and his decision to leave his assets solely to me. "She left," he said plainly. "When I needed her most, she was gone. I cannot allow that to define my legacy. I am choosing the person who never left." When the video ended, the room was utterly still. I walked to the podium. "Some of you may have seen posts online, heard rumors," I began, my voice even. "I will not respond to gossip. I will respond with evidence." The screen lit up again. Verified emails from Julian documenting his intentions. Scanned legal documents, the divorce decree, the settlement agreement, the waiver of rights, with the line where Isabel had relinquished all future claims highlighted in yellow. Then, the final slide. A screenshot of an email Isabel had sent to a friend 6 weeks before the funeral, forwarded to Clara's office by an anonymous source. It read, "I don't care what it takes. I'm going back to get what should have been mine. He owed me, and if his mother wants a war, I'm ready." That was her story, I said, looking out at the rapt audience. "This is mine. And this foundation belongs to the man who earned it." A few people clapped, then more, until the room was filled with applause. I had seen Isabel slip into a back row late. When the lights came up, she stood and walked out, her heels clicking loudly, a desperate sound in the resounding quiet. No one followed her. No one even watched her go. The next morning, the silence was broken. Isabel had posted a new video, a deceptively edited clip of Julian, pieced together to make him sound as if he regretted changing the will, with her own sympathetic voiceover implying I had manipulated him. It was a vile fabrication, but it was slick. Strangers called her brave and me greedy. We didn't panic. We held a press briefing that afternoon. We played the full, unedited video of Julian, calm, clear, and confident. We distributed packets of evidence. Emails from his business partners expressing his disappointment in Isabel's past attempts to contact him for money, the full timeline of her absence, and Marcus the nurse's sworn affidavit. That night, the blog that had praised her issued a retraction. The narrative was fracturing. But she wasn't done. Late that night, Clara called. She's filed a motion to contest the will. Claims Julian lacked mental capacity. Claims coercion. I sat alone at my kitchen table, the legal filing glowing on my laptop screen. Undue influence, emotional manipulation, ruthless. They weren't there when I held his hand through the nausea, when I changed his sheets at 3 a.m., when he asked me with his last clear breath to make sure she never got a penny. I let the grief wash over me, the raw, aching memory of it all, and then I let it go. The next morning I met Clara. "Let's make it final," I said. Our rebuttal was a mountain of truth. Affidavits, financial records, Julian's voice recordings, his private memo. Weeks crawled by. Isabel gave tearful interviews to sympathetic outlets. But the public was warier now. The word alleged began appearing in headlines. The ruling came on a Wednesday morning, not with a bang, but with an email. The judge had dismissed Isabel's motion in full. Her claims were ruled unfounded, speculative, and intentionally misleading. That last phrase was a death knell. It meant consequences. Within 48 hours, the court scheduled a hearing to review sanctions against Isabel and her legal team for abuse of the system. She requested the hearing be closed to the public. The judge denied it. That's when I decided I would be there. I sat in the back row of the small courtroom. Isabel entered, her face a pale, tight mask. The judge was methodical, pulling apart her entire case thread by thread: the edited video, the false affidavits, the financial history. Her lawyer's defense crumbled. Sanctions were recommended. Her lawyer would face the state bar. Isabel was ordered to pay all associated legal fees, a staggering sum, and her accounts were frozen. As the judge read the decision, her carefully composed expression never changed, but her hands clenched and unclenched in her lap, a frantic, silent rhythm. As we were leaving, she turned just enough for me to see the hollow emptiness in her eyes. She had gambled on bending reality to her will and had been broken by it instead. A week later, a handwritten letter arrived. "I need 5 minutes," it said. I met her at a public greenhouse. She was angry, she said, that she had been written out of his history. She hadn't come for the money, but for relevance. "Being forgotten isn't a punishment," I told her, my voice quiet but firm. "It's a consequence. You don't get to disappear from someone's pain and then reappear to claim a prize for their survival." She had no response. She said her life was in ruins. I offered no comfort. "This is the last time we will speak," I said, and walked away. The fraud investigation began a month later, triggered by an anonymous tip. State auditors uncovered a web of shell nonprofits, ghost donors, and forged affiliations she had used to siphon sympathy and cash for years, all under the guise of acting on behalf of my late son. She was stripped of her right to operate any nonprofit, fined heavily, and her name was printed on official state documents detailing her deceit. Even her own daughter released a public statement of estrangement. She was utterly, completely alone. The final time I saw her was a year later, outside the courthouse. She looked raw, stripped of all her former artifice. "I thought I was owed something," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for the life I didn't get." She held out a letter, but I didn't take it. "I don't need your letter, Isabel," I said. She let it fall to the ground between us, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the anonymous crowd. Closure, I've learned, isn't about forgiveness or apologies. It's the quiet moment you realize you no longer need them. I had found a new purpose, joining an advisory council to help older women navigate financial and legal conflicts. I saw myself in their tired eyes, women who had been taught that silence was strength. I told them that clarity is not cruelty, that boundaries are not betrayal, and that speaking the truth does not make you hard, it makes you whole. The legacy Julian left wasn't the $24 million. It was the foundation, the scholarships, the lives he touched. It was a legacy of purpose, something that could not be stolen or tarnished. My victory wasn't in winning the money. It was in protecting that truth. The war was over. The rage had cooled. The grief had softened into a gentle ache. And in the quiet space that remained, I found not vengeance, but something far more valuable, my own peace. The story she tried to write had been erased. The one he lived, the one I had protected, was now etched in stone, a testament not to what we leave behind, but to who we choose to be and who chooses to stay.